So in this video, you're going to learn about Christianity and slavery in America, pretty much how the slaves became Christian over a long period of time despite major obstacles, and why slaveholders were resistant to have slaves convert for such a long time. So first, it's important to know that when it comes to slavery and Christianity and Christianizing the slaves was seen as like a justification for enslavement for a long time. But in reality, that's not really what was going on. Because for a while, missionaries reported that slaveholders refused to have their slaves be Christianized because, well, multiple reasons. First, slaveholders thought that if you made slaves Christian, then that would be making them equal. Because of this fear, people in charge of legislation in America made sure that equality in Christ was not the same as equality through law. Once that was out of the way, there are plenty of more reasons why slaveholders didn't want the slaves to convert. And just to be clear, the slaves did not want to convert either for a long time, but we'll get to that later. The second reason that slaveholders didn't want to Christianize their slaves was for economic-based reasons. As people know, slavery was constant work. Slaveholders, of course, wanted to profit as much as they could from slave labor. So the idea of having off time so that slaves could learn about Christianity, especially when a lot of people didn't believe that black people had souls, it just didn't make sense at the time. This was especially true because towards the beginning of America, it was more about catechism and religious education when it came to Christianity. So people would spend time being sat down and instructed, and slaveholders just didn't think that was worth it for slaves. Even when slaves didn't have to work on the Sabbath day, it was still problematic because slaves used this time for like dancing, singing, and other recreational activities. Essentially, it would have been burdensome for the slaves who said it would have been too much to serve both their earthly and heavenly masters. Of course, we know how slavery went. And even if slaves and slaveholders were more open to the idea of slaves being Christianized, white missionaries of the time felt like they had way too much work on their hands from white people. So, no time for slaves. Another reason why slaves didn't convert that much in the early period of America was because they were seen as brutish by their masters. Pretty much meaning they were incapable of religious instruction, which again was the method of the time. This was in part due to cultural and linguistic barriers that made it hard for slaves to grasp concepts of slavery. The amount of English needed to get by on a plantation was completely different from the amount of English needed to understand Christian doctrine. And so sometimes it just didn't work. Another complaint from slaveholders was the fear that Christianizing the slaves would make them saucy, or in other words, making them think that they were equal to white people. Taking it a step further, some thought that slaves would be even rebellious if being Christianized. And certain slave rebellions, like Nat Turner's rebellion, inspired by Christianity, did not help with that at all. In response to this, most apologists that were for converting the slaves argued that Christianity would actually make slaves better slaves, making them serve out of love and kindness. Right? The biggest obstacle from the slaveholder side, however, was the idea that Christianizing the slaves would disrupt the slave-master hierarchy. Can't have that. And for this reason, many slaveholders were still opposed to Christianizing slaves even after legislation was passed that allowed for it. Opposition didn't just come from slaveholders, however, but also the slaves themselves. Keep in mind that rather than being blank slates, African-born slaves had these cultures and religions that they were coming from that they weren't really eager to give up. It is important though to note that there are some large similarities that made it easier for these slaves to convert later down the line, including belief in God or a supreme creator, belief in an afterlife where the good are rewarded and the evil suffer, belief in prayer to God, and then adoration of God. However, it turns out that the differences would be more important, especially in the beginning stages of America, such as the difference between 3 divine persons and a whole pantheon of divinities, the difference in worship and the lack of drumming, possession, and sacrifice, and also the concept of original sin was just a big thing for African-born slaves who just didn't get it. For a long time, those differences did prove to be difficult. However, these similarities did win out eventually during the period of the Great Awakening. So the Great Awakening, which began in 1740, was the dawn of a new day for Christianizing slaves in America. It was the religious fervor of the period, particularly by Baptists and Methodists, as well as the change in preaching and evangelization that was happening during this time period that made slaves more likely to be Christianized and converted. Before this, it was all about religious instruction, learning it by the books. But with the Great Awakening, it was more about, oh, do you feel the Spirit? Do you feel the Spirit come from you? And do you feel the Spirit come over you and lead you to convert? This style was especially favorable for slaves because it was reminiscent of African styles of worship. In addition to the vibrant amount of emotion during this time period in religion, it was also becoming more popular to believe that slaves were capable of going through the process of conversion. The swarming of Black slaves into Methodist and Baptist congregations led to mixed but segregated congregations. It was not uncommon for the number of Black people in the congregation to far exceed that of the whites. This was especially true in the South. When Blacks became too numerous, there were often separate services held for them. Or, in cities, sometimes they even formed their own separate churches. There were some Black congregations that sprang up before 1800, and they had a certain amount of autonomy and the fact that they could choose their own pastors. However, after 1820, a lot of this early autonomy was gone, and power was back to the white people. Story of our lives, right? Basically, in the year 1800, there was a slave rebellion called Gabriel's Rebellion that completely changed the game. Preachings or religious meetings were used by the group to discuss plans and prepare for the rebellion. Gabriel's brother, Martin, was actually one of the plot leaders, and he was a preacher. And he said that their cause was like that of the Israelites. He said in the Bible, God had promised, 5 of you shall conquer 100 and 100,000 of your enemies. Soon after this, things changed for the worse for Black people in America, and they weren't allowed to gather without white supervision. Despite this, Christianity became more and more popular among the slaves. Even though the same amount of African-born slaves were coming from across the sea, the amount of America-born slaves was greatly increasing, and they didn't have the same cultural and linguistic barriers that African-born slaves did. That being said, even by the 1820s, the majority of Blacks in America were minimally touched by Christianity. You were more likely to be converted if you were working in the house as a house servant, or as a slave artisan, or if you lived in the city. People in rural areas were a lot less likely to be touched by Christianity, which did not mean that they were completely ignorant of it. Because of anti-literacy laws, the only way that they could teach slaves was through the oral method. Pretty much, the teacher would recite a question and recite an answer, and then the students would repeat both until both were memorized. Then the teacher would go around asking each student a question that they would have to answer. But this was not the full extent of Christianity that they were exposed to, the slaves that is. A lot of slave religion lied in what historians have called the invisible institution. Often, Black slaves would steal away and find themselves in woods and thickets, often called hush harbors. The whole point, of course, was to worship in secret. When white preachers preached to Black slaves, they were teaching ad nauseum about being docile and obedient and serving their masters. And this isn't what the slaves wanted to hear about Jesus. In fact, slaves barely even heard about Jesus because they were focusing on such a limited part of the Bible. Even Black preachers would say the exact same things as white preachers in fear of being hurt or whipped. Stealing away to Jesus was not without risk, of course. In fact, it was very dangerous. One slave, Moses Grandy, reported that his brother had his back flogged and pickled for having a secret service. However, this fear did not stop slaves from embracing their heart of Christianity. In addition to using hush harbors, another common practice was to use thoroughly wetted quilts or blankets to mute the sound. In addition to that, another practice was to use a kettle or pot in the middle of the dwelling or towards the door to mute the sound. These meetings sometimes had a preacher, but often they didn't because they didn't need one. There was so much singing and dancing and worshiping that a preacher simply would have just been drowned out. Now, I know a common critique today of Christianity is that it made slaves more docile and obedient, by making them believe in the hereafter and thinking about that rather than worrying about freedom in their lifetime. But the interesting thing is that a lot of slaves use these meetings to pray for freedom in their lifetime, and a lot of them expected it. Just to be clear though, at this time before emancipation, a lot of Black people still were not Christian. Most, in fact. One of the reasons being just hypocrisy. Why would they believe that Christianity was full of hope and love when that's not what they were seeing on the ground every day? I don't know. But it is clear that despite all these obstacles, Christianity eventually took over the Black community and led to the popularity that we see within the Black community today. Now, I know that was a lot of information, but I just wanted to summarize and say, yes, there were a lot of major obstacles from the slaveholder side, but there are also a lot of obstacles from the slave side of why they were not trying to deconvert to Christianity. I will say, one thing I really found interesting about this time period and slavery was the relationship between Christianity and conjure, or magic, on the plantation. However, I think that's a topic for a different video. Thank you for sticking around for this video. This is my first video, and I don't know, it went okay. And so watch some more, and stay tuned.